I'm David Wessel. I'm director of the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy. It's a pleasure to be here today and see a standing room only crowd on tax policy in 2016 when most of us think nothing's going to happen on tax policy this year. It's my pleasure to introduce the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Congressman Kevin Brady. I looked up a little bit about Kevin Brady in preparation for this and discovered that he's not actually from Texas originally. He's from South Dakota. He worked his way through the University of South Dakota and was elected to the city council in Rapid City at age 26. But he is, we all heard the phrase a Chamber of Commerce Republican. I've never actually known what it means. But Congressman Brady really is one. He worked 18 years for various chambers of Congress. He moved to Texas in 1982, served 6 years in the state legislature, was elected to Congress from the Houston suburbs in 1996. He beat his primary opponent last time 68-32, beat his Democratic opponent 89-11, although that doesn't seem to have discouraged three aggressive challengers who are showing up in the March 1st primary to challenge him. Congressman Brady has been in Washington for 20 years, but he still lives in Texas. And I read somewhere, I can't remember where, I hope it's right, that he's logged 2 million miles commuting back and forth, for which America's airlines thank you, Congressman. Now, being chairman of the Ways and Means Committee is, I think we all agree, especially in this room, one of the most important jobs in Congress. Taxes, trade, Social Security, Medicare, it kind of makes you wonder what the other committees do. According to the Ways and Means Committee, 8 presidents, 8 vice presidents, and 21 speakers of the House have served on Ways and Means. Now, Congressman Brady disclosed to my friend Richard Rubin of the Wall Street Journal that actually his wife does his taxes. We won't talk about that. But he really, really wanted to be chairman of Ways and Means. He ran against Paul Ryan for the post a couple of years ago, fought off a challenge from Pat Tiberi when Mr. Ryan became speaker. It's kind of like the dog that chased the car and finally caught it. You caught it, Congressman. Now what are you going to do with it? Congressman Brady has laid out a very ambitious agenda, simpler, flatter tax code with fewer loopholes, deductions, and credits that doesn't disadvantage pass-throughs relative to C-Corps, encourages businesses to locate in the U.S., and promises economic growth. And he says he's going to get it all wrapped up by the end of 2017. So, Congressman, we're interested in hearing how you're going to do that.
The answer is we've got a plan. And so let's talk a little about that. David, thanks for the introduction. Very thorough. Len, thank you for having me here as well and for your leadership of the Tax Policy Institute. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here today to address a problem, I think, whose time has come. A problem that's really slowed the economic growth of our country, that discourages investment at home. I think discourages families as well. It's just plagued us too long, which is our broken tax code. For those of, David made the point, I started out on Main Street. I was a Chamber of Commerce executive in 3 dramatically different economies. In the Midwest, it was agriculture, tourism, and in a military environment. In Beaumont, Texas, it was slow growth, heavy trade, or a union-oriented petrochemical area. In the Woodlands area where I'm now, it is fast-growing in healthcare, energy, and more trade going forward. And so, Main Street looks very different across our country, but there are things that are in common as you work on it. And so spending most of my adult life helping start small businesses, build a business climate, and recruit new industry, you really get a sense for what the tax code does and how it really hurts business owners, job seekers, and those who are working moms and dads who just can't handle this costly, complex, and unfair tax system. I think the American people deserve better. They deserve a tax code that's built for growth, built for the growth of their families' paychecks, built for the growth of local businesses, and built for the growth of America's economy. That's what I'm setting out to do as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. That's why I'm so privileged to follow now Speaker Ryan in that area. It's a responsibility I take very seriously, as do every member of our committee. So in the months ahead, we're going to continue our efforts to advance pro-growth, comprehensive tax reform, and it's based on 6 core principles that were sort of alluded to. First is it has to be simpler, fair, and flatter. It has to be. Today, individuals, families, small businesses, It's just so difficult to grapple with the tax code that's impossible to understand, that has to change. And too many people think they're not rewarded for good work, but for good connections. And that's got to change. Secondly, tax reform has to close loopholes, eliminate special rules, limit deductions, exclusions, and credits that riddle the tax code today so that we can lower rates for everybody. We can't leave everything in place and lower rates and make it simpler. The math doesn't work. And so well-advised taxpayers today use an array of complex tax provisions to minimize their taxes under the law, but that complexity, that effort is a waste of resources. I think drains out of our economy, takes critical time and capital away from growth in the United States. Third, businesses, both large and small, must have a competitive tax system, including a fair and competitive tax rate. Small businesses often feel like they're paying a higher tax rate than larger businesses. They believe they deserve a tax system that encourages growth as well, and we intend to deliver that. Fourth, our tax code has to stop encouraging the shift of jobs overseas. Too many American businesses are being acquired by foreign corporations or engaging in inversion transactions to avoid being a ripe target for foreign takeovers. We need a tax code that encourages businesses to locate their operations in the United States, creating jobs here at home, helping to grow our economy. Fifth, we need a tax code that is built boldly for economic growth. I'm convinced tax reform that merely aims to place America into the middle of the pack won't cut it. Only by aiming high and taking a very ambitious approach to pro-growth tax reform will we be successful in the near and the long term. When Steve Jobs was brought back to Apple to revitalize it, he looked at innovation, and his charge to his best employees were, when you're behind, leapfrog. In other words, don't take action just to get back to the middle of the pack. Leapfrog your competitors. And so the charge I've laid out for our committee is that tax reform in the 21st century shouldn't aim merely to place us in the middle of the pack, but in the lead pack. And the charge I've given our committee is to think bold on the number and the rates we're aiming for. Look at tax reform with fresh eyes. So look at all the ideas across the board, from consumption taxes, reform income taxes, the different ideas we've seen, because just tweaking the tax code we have today simply won't cut it. And it is, frankly, just as difficult politically to go to a mediocre reform as it is to go to a strong reform. So if we're going to make the effort, and a once-in-a-generation opportunity, let's make it worthwhile. And we know there is no perfect way to tax. There just isn't. There are strengths and there are weaknesses, but there are proven ways to grow investment, and that's what we're going for. And finally, a 21st century tax code that's built for growth doesn't raise taxes to bail out Washington's spending problems. That's my final principle here. We know that to eliminate the deficit, we do need fiscal constraint. We do need to address our entitlement challenges in a major way, but we need growth. And the way we do that economically, in my view, you can't do it any better than having the right type of tax reform. Here's the good news. Under the leadership of former Chairman Dave Camp and Paul Ryan, we build off an awful lot of good work, significant groundwork for comprehensive reform. We're going to build on that foundation this year. Just yesterday, we held a hearing, full committee hearing on international tax reform. I think this is a critical first step toward overhauling our tax system, and it's an urgent priority in light of what's going on around the world. When Americans go online, turn on the television each week, they seem to regularly learn of another major American job creator that's moving their headquarters to another country. In the first 2 months of the year, we've already heard of 3 major American companies have decided to move overseas. And while our sky-high corporate tax rate bears much of the blame, other countries have also taken actions with their tax systems that disproportionately burden American companies and ultimately our American workers. For example, the OECD BEPS project, Base Erosion Profit Shifting Project, has advanced ideas that will make it harder for our U.S. companies to compete and grow. Worldwide American companies are rightly concerned this project will result in higher foreign taxes, higher compliance costs, and double taxation. I think in past years, we've seen on average about 2 inversions a year. That picked up last year. In January, there were 3. I think we're hearing the beginning of a giant sucking sound. Some of it generated by our global competitors, the bulk of it generated by a U.S. tax code that is just out of touch with the global economy that we're in today. And so as countries around the world incorporate these ideas in their tax systems, many more companies could be forced to restructure their business operations and move U.S. activities such as research and development overseas. And the European Union state aid investigations is another area. They also threaten to impose retroactive taxes going back a decade on American businesses, and we can't allow American taxpayers to foot the bill for what, in my view, is just a naked revenue grab in Europe and elsewhere. And so here's the key, my view. A direct result of these global developments is the loss of jobs here at home for hardworking Americans. The loss of just any American global business to a foreign merger or a foreign takeover means many of the headquarters jobs will move to the foreign jurisdiction. And because these companies currently have American suppliers and other local businesses that support their operations, the negative impact continues to ripple through our local economy. So when business decisions are made in the new foreign headquarters, foreign vendors will replace many of our American small businesses. So when we talk about fixing international tax reform, we're really talking about ensuring that we have strong U.S. businesses buying from local U.S. vendors and building local communities. And I'm convinced this downward spiral, when these companies leave, will continue until we bring our tax code in the 21st century. And that essential process starts with the international tax system and reform. So I think American families, workers, and job creators have waited long enough for this effort. Ways and Means Committee is ready to deliver on it. And while we're laying the foundation for overall reform in 2017, we think there's an urgency, I believe, to act in some space in international tax reform this year. So with that, David, Lynn, if I could just stop and take easy questions from these guys, as you promised.
All right.
Okay.
That's not exactly what I said. Okay.
Great. Ben.
Thanks. The reason I really like having members of the House here rather than members of the Senate is no member of the Senate has ever been able to speak that briefly, ever. I mean, that's why there's more tweets from the House than the Senate, because the senators can't figure out how to say anything in less than 10 minutes, let alone 144 characters. So is it your intention, Congressman, to try and do international tax reform this year?
It is. And my thinking is we're working off a strong foundation that was already laid. There's an urgency in this area. I think there's bipartisan support for it. I was even encouraged by Secretary Liu's comments in front of our committee about even in a very difficult political environment, he believes there's bipartisan effort to address this. And so what are the elements of that? I think the most urgent one is the need to move now to a territorial system, an exemption system that lowers those tax gates, permanently allows those dollars to flow back in the United States for a couple reasons. One, no one's yet convinced me why a dollar left stranded overseas is better than a dollar brought back home to be invested in America for any reason. Secondly, it sends a strong signal, I think, to businesses in America that we're dead serious about overall tax reform. We're not going to leave pass-throughs behind. We're not going to leave rates behind. In fact, my experience from working through the Camp draft and then the work that then Chairman Ryan did on international tax, frankly, I'd like to be able to address territorial so we can focus on lowering those rates and getting to a far more competitive system.
So most of the proposals on territorial have some kind of a tax, a one-time tax on tax overseas, profits overseas. And would you use that revenue to help address the pass-through rates? Is that what you're saying?
Right now, I think we ought to focus on how do we get the policy right for bringing those dollars home and let companies deploy their capital where it most allows them to grow. I think if we get that policy right, we can have the discussion of where that revenue goes. For me, it would always go to lower rates, or make the code more competitive. I know if this is to be bipartisan, other members have different ideas on where that should go. Let's have that discussion, but first, let's get the policy right on the territorial side.
Now, Bill Hoagland said in an earlier panel that he was concerned, although he shares your concern about how screwed up the corporate tax code is and the damage it's doing, that in a very populist year, it'll be very difficult to explain to people who are worried about their own taxes why Congress has made a priority of cutting taxes for big multinational corporations. How do you see the politics of this?
I don't know of anyone in America who isn't worried about American companies leaving America and headquartering overseas. And while they may not understand what an inversion is, people in my community understood a local business who was our corporate citizen of the year, announcing just months ago he's inverting, they are inverting to Canada for a number of key competitive reasons. They get that we're not competitive, and they're concerned about, in this case, I think local jobs will stay, but they're concerned about what happens there. So in my view, we can make the case that bringing those dollars home and reinvesting in jobs and research and plants and equipment here really matters.
Another thing that came up before you came in was what a number of people, actually all of them, identified as a huge disconnect between what people are hearing on the campaign trail from the Republican candidates and what they're hearing at hearings like the one you had yesterday. And in particular, the point was made that each of the leading Republican candidates has tax proposals that, by the Tax Policy Center estimates, would reduce revenues by trillions of dollars over the next decade. And even if you did dynamic scoring and took what Joint Tax and CBO are likely to say at the top end of what this might do for growth, would still be major revenue losers. So if we get a Republican president, and if that person has campaigned on $6, $8, $9, $10 trillion of tax cuts, how are you going to manage that in Ways and Means?
Here's my thinking. One, I think it's really encouraging that each of the serious candidates has a serious tax reform proposal. Not all of them are fleshed out so that you can really estimate exactly what they achieve, but I think it's clear that, especially on the Republican side, a new president's going to make this a top priority. That's very good news. Each of them have different areas that I think are very pro-growth, so they all have something I think that's worth looking at. And my thought on the revenue side of things, that revenue neutral within dynamic scoring. So a real-life analysis, a rational economic analysis of tax reform will bring us, I think, the space to be very pro-growth. But I've said very clearly, we're not going to leave growth on the table if we're off a dime or two. We're going for the growth and the opportunities. I think within dynamic scoring, that gets us to where we need to be.
But if we do the dynamic scoring that Joint Tax and CBO have discussed, there's no way that the Republican candidates are going to be revenue neutral.
Each of those provisions, and I've got every one of their proposals in my briefcase as we speak, going through that. There are elements in each one of them that are, I think, very pro-growth, and so we'll go from there.
I'm interested in a political point you made where you said that incremental changes that get you mediocre tax reform are as politically difficult as comprehensive reform, which is maybe the most encouraging thing I've heard lately. But I just wanted to explain to me a little, because it seems to me the problem is, as you well know, that when you do comprehensive reform, there are lots of losers. There are people who are gaming the system. There are people who love those deductions and credits you want to get away with. There are some businesses that like the current international code because they find a way to exploit it. So do you have a political strategy for doing comprehensive reform, recognizing you're going to have a lot of enemies, and in a Congress that seems very polarized and very difficult to get things done?
Tax reform is always difficult. That's why it happens once a generation. And I would alter my remark in this way. It's more politically difficult to do a mediocre tax reform than it is to do something that gets people excited about being competitive again. It's incredibly difficult. My point is not all the deductions and exclusions will go, but not all of them will stay. And each one's going to be weighed on how much does this grow the economy? How much does this grow paychecks? It's all going to be, rather than focus merely on tax policy, it's going to be on economic growth. And that's where we want to drive this discussion. But, look, we don't go into tax reform with rose-colored glasses here. We know it's hard. But you've got to find a way that the average family understands why simplifying the code is better for them.
And how important is it for you to look forward a decade and see the deficit shrinking and the debt stabilizing or coming down? Revenue neutral with dynamic scoring is a good thing if it gets the economy growing better. It doesn't do much to reduce the future deficits. So do you look at taxes won't help us reduce deficits, and you think you can do it all on the spending side?
Economic growth is the key. I think you get halfway back to a balanced budget through spending cuts to actually finish that job, and having strong enough growth to start paying down the debt. You need economic growth. You really need both of those. So fiscal constraint, both on discretionary and getting our financial house in order on our entitlements, really critical. But you've got to have growth, because the difference between what we're seeing now, 2% plus, versus what we've been doing for half a century, 3% plus, is dramatic. In fact, over 50 years, ran the numbers of Joint Economic Committee. I think having just that slow of growth reduces our federal tax revenues by $90 trillion over that period, and reduces our economy by a third. So growth, critically important for not just financial stability, but for balancing our budget and living within our means.
Are you suggesting that the only tools that the government has to get faster growth are tax cuts, that there's nothing on the spending side that might do that?
Well, I think on the regulatory side, certainly. I think more free trade is critical to the economy. I think a sound dollar that focuses on not stimulating so much as protecting the value of the dollar over time, the strength of the dollar over time. All of those are critical. Tax reform alone won't do it, but it's a critical part of that.
But spending on infrastructure, on education, on kids, do you look at those as
all those, yeah, absolutely. They are. And, I'll tell you, I'm one of those that believes if those changes are big enough, we ought to do dynamic scoring in those areas as well. I don't have any problem with weighing what the impacts of these investments are, rather than sort of the estimates we get. Sometimes they're dramatically overestimated, sometimes not. If the changes are big enough that can capture dynamic scoring, let's use it.
Okay. I think we have time for some questions. Fred Goldberg, do you want to start? Can we have a mic over here?
Thank you, Congressman. This topic to date has been about tax policy, but the other side of all of this is administration and the Internal Revenue Service. Yeah. And if you could comment briefly on that side of your portfolio, there are many of us who live in that world that believe the systematic underfunding of tax administration, the ultimate folks suffering from that are taxpayers. And I certainly appreciate the issues with the IRS, but if you could talk about that side of your responsibility, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I long for the day when the IRS was truly an independent agency, where I frankly couldn't tell you which party the commissioner was from when they were in our office twice a year talking about their challenges on customer service. Those days seem like a quaint memory. I think the IRS has lost credibility through this process and continue to, because they simply won't address those issues. And I think the moment they start to, in an independent, objective way, I think you'll see support for stronger customer service. Our argument would be they've spent their money poorly that they have, diverted from a number of areas they shouldn't be in, and taken money in key funds away from customer service to what I would say are more political uses. And so, one, they need to do a better job of what they have. Two, when they restore credibility, I think there'll be bipartisan support for resources.
What are you talking about here? I mean, really, I mean, there's an incident on the 403B or whatever it was. You think the agency is now politically motivated?
Yes, I do. Far too much. Not the rank and file members, to be honest. Frankly, they provide for our tax folks and our small businesses. They, in my view, bust their tail for us. But yeah, I think the agency has lost credibility. And I think they can get it back. And I think it's not just one instant. I think, frankly, is in the implementation of tax areas, the Affordable Care Act, there have been real problems. I know in our efforts to try to really just open the books, let's see what happened. Let's make sure, no American, I don't care what party you're in, is targeted based on their political beliefs. You can't allow that to happen. But you create a new culture there, a new openness toward Congress, you'll see some different
and how do
results.
Is customer service include enforcement and auditing and all those things that all of us hate, but some of us believe are essential?
No, it has to be. It's essential. The question is, in GAO just did a series of reports, as you know, about the auditing practices at the IRS and revealed a number of areas where it's just far too open to political considerations rather than the driving of the actual audits themselves. And so we're trying to close those loopholes. And I'm anxious, frankly, for an IRS commissioner who I don't know whose party they're in, who runs that agency differently than what we have today.
Bob Posen?
I'm encouraged to hear that you want to do international corporate tax reform first, because I agree it's a big problem. One of the real challenges is if you are able to reduce the corporate rate to 25% by using some of the revenue that you get from international tax and closing other loopholes, the pass-throughs don't feel they don't get a benefit from that. And I was wondering how you're going to deal with that issue, or are you going to leave that to another year?
I think it would be difficult, one, to generate enough revenue from territorial system to dramatically lower corporate rates without huge tolls on those dollars coming back, which is counterproductive in this process. We want those tax gates to be lowered and affordable to make sure that money flows back. I'm thinking more about having that discussion on where we use those revenues, whether it's on the corporate side, the pass-through side, reserved for comprehensive reform. All of those, in my view, are pretty positive directions. I know the Democrats feel strongly about more investment, more infrastructure, more areas like that. Again, let's have that discussion once we agree on the right policy on how we bring those dollars back, which still, it needs some work, but there's bipartisan interest in approaching that. We've looked at the innovation box, obviously, because it's worked in Europe in selected areas, coupled with lower corporate tax rates, made them very innovative. The initial drafts were, received, with an okay response, a lot of feedback. Truthfully, as we lay out drafts, we get smarter every time. Every time Dave Kemp, Paul Ryan, others lay out a draft in a certain area, the feedback we get, we just get more clarity on how this complex code fits and how their competitiveness around the world, how they view it. And so we're going to take a look at those things.
Can I ask you about a comment you made about the OECD and BEPS, where you made the point, which a number have had, that the Europeans seem to be interested in raising their tax revenues from our companies at our expense. But the way you frame it suggests that there's a competition between the governments to see who can get the jobs and the tax revenue. Do you think there's any way to have an international effort to make sure that the companies pay taxes somewhere? Do we have any common interest with the other OECD?
Well, I think the overall BEPS approach is exactly to that point. And I think they've also sort of evolved from that to recognize there are stranded profits around the world. Why not grab it for ourselves? Mm-hmm. And as we're doing it, let's make changes in our own tax code that draws that investment, because the nexus part of base erosion. You know, having something in that country drives more investment and more location, more R&D overseas. I don't blame them totally for the sucking sound. We are equally responsible, but part of the hearing yesterday made the case, if you're ignoring this confluence of tax changes around the world, you're ignoring something that's a real risk.
Right, but do you see any way to work with your counterparts overseas rather than a zero-sum game against them?
Well, we're in a competitive world. You know, they're not lowering these rates, you know, for fun. They're doing it to increase jobs and investment, attract it. And if we don't engage ourselves, you know, we're going to see not just our jobs base, we're going to see our tax base go overseas, I think.
Bill Gale, do you want to ask a question?
Thanks. So Ways and Means has an enormous portfolio, including not just taxes, but Social Security and Medicare.
Yeah.
That's got to create a lot of work, but it also creates the option for deals. I was wondering if you could talk about the idea of a fiscal grand bargain involving taxes and entitlements and how that might work through Ways and Means.
Because comprehensive tax reform isn't ambitious enough.
Yes.
You know, I'm not a fan of the grand bargain approach, simply because, to your point, each of these areas is incredibly substantive and difficult, and it's not hard to put so much weight on a swimmer that they sink. And I think that tends to be what happens in these areas. Certainly for tax reform, you know, we're going to have a lot on our plate just moving this, even if we're taking a first step and that leads to overall. And there's resistance, as you know, to that as well. We don't know how far we can move some element of pro-growth reform this year, but we're going to try it. And we're also going to lay the foundation for overall reform. And then to your second point, there's no question, portfolio Ways and Means on trade, welfare reform, Social Security, Medicare. We're actually, especially in the Medicare area, building off some momentum. You know, fixing the way we pay our local doctors, sort of transforming the future into off of procedures and more on quality, was the first and most important step to saving Medicare for the long term. Now the second step is doing the same redesign within the way we reimburse others within Medicare. And then the third, I think, final step on Medicare is to create more options for seniors. One of them is premium support, a tailored Medicare plan that works for you in retirement. So we've sort of laid out in Ways and Means a three-step approach to how we tackle Medicare, which is not the 800-pound gorilla, it's the 8,000-pound gorilla in our budget. It's going to take a lot of work to do that.
Henry Aaron?
I probably should have talked longer.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just thinking.
I know, you're new chairman. You'll
Man,
learn.
I got to learn this stuff.
It's almost over.
Yeah.
You're doing really well, sir. Especially for a new guy.
Okay, so you're giving me a little break.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take it.
Two questions.
Yes, sir.
The first is on repatriation of funds held overseas by corporations. Any tax that would be levied on that would be a windfall and a one-time gain. It wouldn't continue forever. If one uses that revenue to finance cuts in rates, that is forever. So even if things are balanced within the revenue estimating period, that measure would bake into the cake an increase in deficits in the future. Does that cause you concern? That's question one. The second question refers back to entitlement reform. Usually that's a softer way of saying cutting benefits. Do you mean it in that fashion? If so, how would you cut Social Security?
Yeah, why don't we reverse it? Why don't we start with Medicare? On Medicare, clearly not built financially for the long term, hospital trust fund being the first one up in a decade. How we use those revenues is increasingly more important. What we're seeing are major changes in the way providers actually use Medicare dollars. We're moving dramatically closer to value-based reimbursement. The quality of the care, carefully coordinated, sort of the reverse of of the old school thinking, which is cost controls out of Washington, mandates, the government micromanaging every moment of your healthcare practice, toward sort of a 21st century approach, which is more competition, more quality, us actually stepping back and you taking on more risk and reward for providing quality care. Those 21st century solutions are coming, are already happening, and I would say 25% of our healthcare sector are already there. We're gonna need that type of innovation to stretch the Medicare dollars. Good example, we've got, most of our healthcare is regional. You're seeing these great innovative models already happening, some of whom in a year's time have served more patients with higher quality and 11% fewer Medicare costs. And they estimate that they believe they can provide the same or higher quality care to patients at 20 to 40% less than they're getting today. So the key on Medicare is to really drive the innovations that allow us to stretch those dollars much further. And as the physicians will tell you, the reforms we're making there end up with similar reimbursement totals, but a whole different way you provide quality care. So that's my thinking on Medicare reform. You're not going through line item cutting this reimbursement, that reimbursement. You're changing, redesigning the incentives.
But he asked about Social Security as well.
Oh, look, we all know what we have to do on Social Security. You have to gradually raise the full retirement age to 70 over the next 3.5 decades or more. Means test wealthier Americans within Social Security, and create a true cost of living for seniors. You do those three things, and you've solidified Social Security for 75 years or more. I would say we also ought to explore some other options within Social Security that allow younger workers to invest more wisely and allow that to grow for them. But my point would be, I think everyone in this room and on Capitol Hill knows that we've got to take concrete steps in Social Security and Medicare.
And his other question was, are you
Growth
at risk of
matters.
using the
Yeah.
one-time revenues from repatriation to permanent rate reductions?
First, I may not get my way. Two, permanent rate cuts work. Permanent tax changes work. Stimulus, one-offs, they have a mixed result. And I still am convinced, done responsibly, done right, economic growth matters to our deficits.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're out of time. The congressman's been very generous
Did
with
I
his.
filibuster all the way through that deal? No, I really was trying to answer the question on Medicare and Social Security. Look, there's innovative ways to tackle these things.
I'd say if you want to filibuster, you've got a long way to go.